Dom and Johnny in the morning. Oh, we had good harmony on that one.
We did. I also like how I never know what the subject is before we go into this.
Oh, that's right. You could always ask.
No.
Sometimes I know. Sometimes I think of it on the day.
I hope the listeners know. I have no idea what we're talking about today.
Well, so I got an email last night before I went to bed requesting a topic that I thought was interesting. We kind of just touched on it because we talked about testing, the value of testing, and whether or not we feel as instructors are being evaluated when our students test with a different instructor. But this specific one is about black belt testing. So our school has a black belt test coming up in just a few days. This was actually the father of one of the students that's going to be testing for first degree asking this question. And he was really just asking, how do you mentally prepare for a black belt test? Because it is different than under black belt rank testing.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it kind of leads into, the point of black belt testing, because we would never put someone on a black belt test that we haven't essentially already tested. That's pretty much what the candidate workouts are about. It's not a pass or fail, but we know at the end of each candidate meeting who's going up for black belt and who's not.
Yeah.
And that's essentially the test. Going on a black belt test is just pushing you past what you think is possible. I've been on tests where I haven't done half my, material.
Yeah.
I'm not being tested on my material. I'm being tested on essentially my mental and physical fortitude, or even mental and physical elasticity. Your ability to adjust
That's
on
a good
the
way
fly.
to put it.
Yeah. So I think being mentally prepared is an interesting one.
Yeah.
Most people are always asking about how you can be physically prepared. So the asker of this question is on a different level.
So black belt testing is fundamentally different than under black belt testing. In our style, when you go to test for under black belt ranks, usually the test is 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the rank you're going for and your age. So, the younger the kids are and the lower in ranks they are, the less time we make them test. Usually, the goal is to impart 2 or 3 nuggets of wisdom, because a test is a much more serious formal evaluation. So, we discussed that in the other testing podcast about one of the values of having a different voice is that the same lesson might seep in differently. I can't tell you the number of times that, our instructor has taught a lesson and taught that lesson, for years and years. And then one of his students goes to a seminar or speaks to a different instructor. They basically say the same lesson in a slightly different way, but they come back with this epiphany like, did you know if you bend your knees, you can like push your heel into the ground? It's like, whoa! But, like, to your point, black belt testing, instead of being 45 minutes to an hour, it's usually 4 to 5 hours long. So it's a much longer, much more intense experience. And the other thing that it isn't pass-fail, one of the things I tell my students is that it's partially academic, partially diagnostic. So, if you think about academics, usually you study content and then the test is supposed to let you know how well you absorbed that content. The black belt test there's a little bit of that, right? But there's also like, what are ways that we can unpack the true lesson of what you should have been learning with each thing, practicing it in an unfamiliar way, and that's where the elasticity comes in. It's letting you know what you're capable of by asking you to do things that you're not comfortable with. Because ultimately, if you need to defend yourself, it's an uncomfortable situation.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, there's a lot of unknowns in that situation. So there used to be this rule, and I largely try to keep to it, but, I'll explain that in a second. But like you weren't supposed to talk about the black belt test. It was like taboo to even discuss the details of it. The idea being that it creates this kind of tension ahead of time so that you take it more seriously, and also, you're not going to go in with the wrong attitude. Sometimes I'll mention slight examples, if nothing else, to highlight the fact that you actually don't know what's going to happen. So one of those examples is on one of my black belt tests. I was asked to do a bunch of forms with my eyes closed. So I say that because I've also seen that done like in other seminars and stuff. So it's not one of those things that's so way out there that like I feel like I'm spoiling things. And it was only on one test, and I've never heard of somebody else doing that on a different test, which highlights the fact that a lot of times instructors are they're pulling out weird drills. Like you've talked about Master Whitney, doing forms with one shoe on and then like a sock on the other foot. And
Yeah.
and that really messes up your rooting and your stance work and stuff, but you learn a lot about the form that way and can appreciate it differently. That's the kind of stuff that you're often asked to do on a black belt test.
I think if you're trying to mentally prepare, a good thing to remember is you're not going to deserve the black belt. And that's like the whole what it used to be. You're always going to be underqualified for the job you're in,
Mm,
because by the time you're qualified, it means you're ready to get a promotion.
right.
And it's the same with black belt. You're all you're doing is fighting to prove that you're ready to take on the challenges of black belt. And then once you wrap it around your waist, your job is to work as hard as you can to deserve it. So I think that's a good way to frame it, and just remember that this is this is the interview.
Yeah.
This is the interview for a job that you are not ready for. And then once you get it, that's the exciting part, because now you get to think, okay, how do I prove myself to the belt that's around my waist? Belt's just fabric, doesn't really mean anything. But that's for me, that's the mental part. Is not the interview. It's once I get the job, how am I going to represent my position as a black belt?
Well, and I think that's a really healthy way to look at it. I've definitely met martial artists that are basically in the opposite mental place, where they're coming up to people and being like, I'm a sixth, seventh, ninth, 10th, bajillionth degree, like because I have this many stripes, I must be this good. And, you need to listen to me because I'm an authority on this. And it's very obvious from just the way they're moving and the way that they're navigating the world. It's like, you may have been that at one point, but right now it looks like if you were to fall, you wouldn't even be able to pick yourself up unassisted.
Mm,
Like so that our our state is in constant flux. So it is a good reminder that you may earn the right to wear a rank at one point because of a demonstration of skill, but that does not tenure you to that position. I mean, that also doesn't mean that, I'm going to look at someone. I know instructors that have done this, where they look at someone and go, "You're wearing a third degree, but I'm demoting you to brown belt because you're not skillful enough to wear that rank."
yeah, I hate that.
Yeah, so I'm not going to ask anyone for their certificate back, but it's more just like it is good to acknowledge that we're in a constant state of flux, and it doesn't really, the belt rank is about where you're at on like a personal growth cycle. And I also want to acknowledge the other side. I've had a handful of students over the years speak to me about the fact that they feel like imposter syndrome, where they
Mm,
feel like, I don't deserve to wear a black belt because, I have this weakness, or, I have this lack of capability in something specific. And it's like, well, that's the other thing, is that it's not pass or fail. If you do part of the black belt test and, they ask you to do something and you feel like you did not pass that part, it doesn't mean you're a failure as a martial artist. It just is giving you direction of what to incorporate into your training,
mhm.
So, like, every gun and knife defense section of a black belt test I've ever been on, and I've told this to my students, I've had the instructor basically look at me and go, "You're doing it wrong," which is always funny because sometimes you're doing what an instructor previously told you to do on the same test. Like they're like, do this, so you do what they tell you to do, and then another instructor comes up and they're like, you're doing it wrong, and it's like, well, I don't know what to do then. So, but that's like the thing is like, what is successful? In a knife fight, it's getting out alive, right? It's if you get cut, that's kind of part of a knife fight. That's why you
Hmm.
shouldn't play with knives, kids.
Yeah.
So, but I think there's so much wiggle room in it. It can be hard when you think that you're working to earn the right to wear the rank that you're currently wearing. It can be hard to find stable footing and understanding exactly where you're at.
But I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think imposter syndrome can be healthy, if you channel it correctly, because if you have imposter syndrome and it drives you to improve,
Hmm.
that's great. If you have imposter syndrome and then you let it take over, where you're just like, well, I'm not good enough, so why am I trying?
Yeah.
So I think that takes some mental fortitude too.
So the way I've heard it described, which I kind of like, is anytime you have that feeling of doubt, it's some part of yourself trying to love you and keep you safe, which isn't always the best thing to do, right? It's kind of like when you want to stop doing push-ups because your arms hurt. It's a part of you trying to keep yourself safe and keeping you from getting hurt. And also, sometimes you have to quietly soothe that part and let it know everything's gonna be okay, and then
Yeah,
do the work anyway. And
yeah.
that can be really hard for a lot of people. And ultimately, it's a way of resolving a lot of conflicts that can happen in your personal and professional life, in a
Hmm.
safe practice space, which is the dojo, before you have to deal with those conflicts where there are even more variables to consider. Dom and Johnny in the morning.